Hi guys, I'm Mike and this is F1 Fanatics. Welcome back to another F1 Worldwide, the fan podcast, and today joining us from Rich TJ Racing, we have JJ, and he is part of a team of four. There are two other Jameses, which is why JJ is referred to on the channel as JJ, and Suzanne as well, who helps run the channel. But JJ's here for today representing a channel that started off around about the same time that we started off on F1 YouTube. I think it was actually a month after. But JJ, thank you very much for coming on.
No problem, Michael. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for having me on the show. Great to be here.
No problem at all, mate. It's great to finally get a collaboration because I think we initially kind of discussed it. Maybe it was in the very early stages. I remember talking to Suzanne about it. But it's finally happened and we finally got you on for an episode. And guys, if you haven't checked out Rich T Racing already, please do go and drop them a subscribe. Obviously, leave a link in the description down below. Just like us, do a lot of F1 content. Also, a lot of go-karting when obviously the coronavirus isn't happening and stuff like go-karting can actually happen. They have a lot of brilliant content on that, and yeah, just some really great F1 content. But as always on the F1 Worldwide podcast, we're not just here to promote other channels or other people in the F1 community. It is to kind of have a discussion about F1. And today's topic, you would have figured out by the thumbnail, is talking about the golden era of F1. And so what we're going to do is me and JJ are kind of going to decide what we think, or have a discussion what we think is the best decade of Formula One to date. And we'll start off throwing it over to JJ, but just as our point that we're going to go through, we had a pre-discussion before recording. We're going to rule out the 1950s, 60s and 70s from this discussion because although obviously brilliant drivers in that time, there were obviously fantastic races, guys who have really had a massive impact within the sport, as a whole package, you know, F1 wasn't really, the real deal at that stage. The TV coverage wasn't there until kind of like the mid-70s. Obviously, the amount of people who died driving in F1 was crazy to think about and abounds, and it just doesn't feel right to have an era that had so much death where people lost their lives for the sport as a golden era as such to celebrate. But JJ, over to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, obviously we had that pre-discussion, and it was funny because I've already thought this through, and that's exactly what I was going to say. So, completely agree with everything you just said. So, for me, depends what we're talking about when we say the best decade. We're talking about the best decade or like the golden era, I suppose, of Formula One. Because for me, I think for pretty much everyone, Formula One basically started properly, or it became what we know today, the global phenomenon that it is, back in probably 1976 with the Hunt Lauda era, and that obviously that amazingly famous season that's created so much media since. Obviously, there have been many films made about it. Obviously, the Rush as well, one of the best racing films ever made, was based on the 1976 season. But again, the 70s were an era where there was still that immense danger. And obviously, in the 76 itself, you had the Niki Lauda accident, how he survived that is hitherto unknown. Obviously, shows the strength of the man, and obviously, again, we had the anniversary of his passing not too long ago. So still miss Nicky. But yeah, so anyway, so yeah, still ruling out the 70s. So if I had to put my money on the table right now, and I think this could be controversial, I want to rule out another decade, if you'll allow me to, Michael.
I will, JJ. I'm very interested to see which one we're going to rule out.
I would like to rule out the 2010s because, yes, we had 2010 and 2012 and 14 and 16, really. They were some great seasons, like great championship fights. Is what I'm going to base the majority of what I think is the best decade on, the championship fights. But also, we had the two dominant, like the amount of domination we've seen in the 2010s from Red Bull and then Mercedes, and obviously the switch from the V8 engines to the V6s. Whilst I don't have so much of a problem with them anymore, when you look back at old races, particularly like obviously through this time, I think I've been watching a lot of the F1 archive. When you see, even just the sound of the old V8 cars just trumps the V6s all any day of the year. And also the fact you've seen since 2017 the massive split between Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari versus the midfield. It's just, for me, it's just completely ruined the show. And whilst and DRS as well, all of this stuff that's come in that's just sort of made F1 feel even more artificial than it technically already is. I just can't. I could not be able to get on board with saying 20, like even considering 2010s as the best decade of Formula One, in my opinion. Obviously, interested to hear what you have to think of this, Michael.
I'd agree with that, JJ. I definitely think what is in 2010's favour and what people will always do. I think I put out a poll on Twitter this, and the actual poll result, I said 1980s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. And the 1990s came out on top. And a lot of the affiliation to the 1990s come from people going, that's when I got into F1, that's why I got love. So I think people who argue 2010s would be, well, that's the only era of F1 I've properly watched and embraced in. And they get that. And 2010 and 2012 are two of the best seasons of F1 in modern history, at least. And they were incredible.
No, I would argue 2012 is the best season of Formula One ever. It was, because I've gone back to it quite a lot through the archive, and it's just the fact that Pastor Maldonado can win in a Williams, the fact that you had, well, I think it was 13 drivers from 7 different constructors standing on a podium, showed how varied it was and how weird results could be thrown out. I think at Spain, Heikki Kovalainen was running 5th in the Caterham for a small amount of time. So it just showed how varied that year was. But it doesn't make up for the rest of it, in my opinion.
No, absolutely. We can agree. Where 2012 definitely for me was the best season of the decade. But yeah, you can certainly make a very strong case for it being one of the best of all time. Like you said, there were so many just variation and drivers competing on the grid, and it just seemed everyone on their given day had a chance, and it varied from circuit to circuit. And although, like, Red Bull won in the end, and it's a bit like 2003 with Ferrari, it kind of gets lost in that when you see Vettel wins that season, you just go, well, Red Bull, it was in the middle of their 4-year dominance. Another title for Sebastian Vettel. Of course he's winning, he's got the best car, but for a lot of that season he didn't. And, you know, the McLaren that actually was the best car performance was up and down, and it just had a bit of everything. But I think it is fair to rule out, because like you said, it doesn't really make up for everything else. Although I enjoyed the title rivalry between Nico and Lewis compared to others across history, it isn't, I suppose it never will, it never will be kind of revered as much as the others, just because Nico, completely understandably, because he achieved all that he wanted in the sport, became a world champion, but it ended, so it almost felt like unfinished business. I always wanted to see another season of it for it to become a real classic rivalry.
I think the problem with Rosberg Hamilton was that it was like a lot of comparisons were drawn between Prost and Senna. They were obviously in the same team, but Hamilton, Rosberg, there was no Suzuka moment. They're like, okay, they came together in Spain, but it was always it always had to be very politically correct, make sure they say the right thing, apologise to the team, etc. But Prost, Senna, they just didn't care. Prost would call Senna the most dangerous person ever. Senna would do it deliberately. It was a completely different mentality, and that's why I think Rosberg Hamilton will never be looked upon the same way as rivalries from back in the day. And then I also think, like, it's the fact that they were in the same team as well. They had the same machinery. It wasn't like you knew they were always going to be talking together. It just sort of dulled it for me. And there was never any major, genuine, proper flashpoints where they started like genuinely falling out. They were always sort of making sure they were correct for the camera type thing. So that's another thing that doesn't work for me. And then also you got the recent one, Hamilton versus Vettel, but that's not really been a rivalry at all. That's just been Hamilton and Mercedes being on top of their game and Vettel and Ferrari making mistakes. So you can't call that a rivalry either, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Admittedly, there's great respect between the two champions who dominated the decade, but they never had a crossover. Hamilton in the McLaren never challenged Vettel in his Red Bull years, and Vettel in the Ferrari never challenged Lewis Hamilton. I know people will often go, he's the one who got closest, but for me, Vettel and a Ferrari never mounted a serious title challenge, because a serious title challenge for me has to go down to the last race or the last two races. It goes down to the wire, and Ferrari and Vettel, for whatever reason, it never panned out. So I think ruling out the 2010s, it is probably a good shout. And also I think it saw the end of Bernie Ecclestone staying too long. Obviously he did an F1 Legacies with Dan a couple of weeks back on it, and talking about Bernie's legacy, and it was just he held on to the sport too long, and it's almost been with the back end of the 2010s, Liberty Media trying to fix what Bernie put in place, and obviously we're all hoping that the 2022 regulations lead to much more competitive racing across the field that we've seen in more the 90s and the 2000s on a regular basis, I would say.
Yeah, there's someone I really, really want to talk to, and that's Tony Fernandez, the guy that sorted out Lotus and then Caterham back in 2009, because he came into the sport when there was the talk of the budget cap, and that a brand new team could become competitive within 5 years. But then obviously that got scrapped. So I'd really like to know what he thinks of what the 2022 regulations are going to do, and then like draw comparisons between the two. Because I started watching the 2009 season and on the archive, and it's just interesting to see like that you can clearly see this is what Liberty are trying to do again, and it's amazing how it's taken over 10 years now for that to be sorted out. So yeah, I think it is. I think it's too simple to say it's all Bernie's fault, but I think he has to play a major part in it. And again, as you say, his holding on to the sport for too long had real detriment for F1 in the 2010s.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would actually be a really fascinating conversation, because the teams who joined in 2010 were almost sold on the back of a lie, and which is probably a result of what these guys realised. They invested into the sport realising that they weren't actually going to be competitive, but they probably rushed their going because they're going, oh, well, the budget cap's in place, so we might as well get that. And then, like you said, it never happened. It's taken 10 years to go in place. Obviously, with the result of COVID-19, I think it is enforced and made it easier to enforce that budget cap, because the major teams like Ferrari, who are the ones probably the most anti it, realise, well, they can be the best team within Formula One, but if there's no Formula One with teams within it, so if there's only like 3 or 4 teams who can compete in F1, then it doesn't really mean anything to win it. To have strong teams is in their interest. So yeah, it'd be fascinating. But I think we'll probably go back and look at the 1980s before we go 80s, 90s, 2000s before drawing a conclusion. So how would you rank 80s in this discussion, JJ?
80s I'd have to say the 80s are of the three, they're the one I know about the least. Because obviously I'm 96. It's not an era I know an awful lot about, but from what I can see, this is where F1 went absolutely mad, and this is where the regulations getting brought in to sort of keep the cars to a safe level had to be brought in, because they were just going absolutely nuts with it. You had ground what's it called, ground control.
Ground control, Major Tom. No, ground effect. that was the one from it.
Ground effect. And obviously the engines that could chuck out. I think I was watching something on Sky Sports F1, and it was Damon Hill driving Nigel Mansell's Williams from about 1986, and he said it could chuck out about 1,500 brake horsepower in a car that was that big. That small, and obviously in a time where all stuff like carbon fibre and proper safety mechanisms weren't really known too much about, or they were only just coming in. So it was just absolutely nuts as a decade. And I think that's when you had like Ron Dennis coming in at McLaren. And I think that's where the 80s are where the teams began to take a massive toll on Formula One. And also it's where aero wasn't that big of a deal. So mechanical grip was everything. And that for me is what I think everyone looks at for the 80s. And also got to say the names involved in the sport, even from the driver's side, you had like Rosberg, Prost, Lauda, Senna, Mansell, Piquet, all of these guys culminating in, so you've got mad cars with semi mad teams with mad drivers as well. I think I was reading somewhere that Piquet once had his car set up so that the suspension or the springs were barely bouncing, and he was like blacking out down the straight, but he kept his foot in to try and get the best lap possible. And it's just, you hear about stories like that, and you're like, how on earth could that have run successfully? But it did, and I think a lot of people still look at it with great reverence. And the fact that ground effect is coming back shows just how ahead, perhaps even how far ahead of its time the 80s were. So yeah, I think the 80s can be looked at very, very positive. Obviously, you still had the safety issue. I think Gilles Villeneuve had his fatal accident in the 80s, so it was still not a safe time, but it was certainly improving massively. And I think it's one of those, like, you can't not talk about the 80s as being one of the best ever.
Yeah, I think the main positive for the 80s for me has to be the drivers that competed in it. Yeah, Gilles Villeneuve obviously, sadly lost his life in 1982. The emergence of Senna, the emergence of Mansell.
I don't think you mentioned Senna, sorry.
Yeah, the emergence of Piquet, basically the best years of Prost. Prost was supreme during the 80s. You know, you can have your argument either way of who was better overall between Prost and Senna, but in the 80s, Prost reigned supreme. He was absolutely immense during that time. And just watching recently the 1984 Monaco Grand Prix, and there was a young Stefan Beloff who sadly lost his life in 1985. He might have gone on to be the first German world champion. He was a supreme talent, taking a Tyrrell from 20th to 3rd, later disqualified for a weight infringement in that race. But I just think the driving was really raw in the 80s, and the incidents, they were severe when they happened. And obviously, ground effect had to be banned on the safety front, and it was that kind of crossover between finding what was safe and what was still pushing the cars to the limit. But the turbocharged engines, when they came in, Nelson Piquet was obviously the first one to win in a turbocharged. I still think it had that brilliance of innovation, that the cars still looked fairly different to each other. Yes, you had the dominance of the McLarens at the back end of that, the first team to really, in the modern era of F1, dominate a set period of time within the sport, with the two top talents within the sport. But yeah, it had the driver rivalries, it had Piquet versus Mansell, it had Prost versus Senna, it had Lauda versus Prost, obviously, in that 84 season. The 1982 season was mental because it was marred by tragedy, but Keke Rosberg won his only world title with one win, which is mental. But it was a brilliant decade of racing, I think.
Yeah, and as well, something else I think we haven't touched on is the fact that technology had not really made its way into the sport by that point. This was still where I don't think they didn't have power steering, manual gearbox. Like watching like onboards of Senna when he had a manual gearbox, trying to feather his way, like driving one-handed round pretty much the entirety of the track is just mad. And I think that's what gives the 80s it's sort of like its special place, so to speak, in the mind in everyone's minds, because it was just bare knuckled racing effectively. It's just, right, there's the car, it's got this amount of power, turn the wheel, change gear, try and go as fast as possible. That, I think, that sums up the 80s in effect. And obviously but they were still so fast, and they still managed to pull it off spectacularly. So yeah, I really take your point on board about the drivers as well. They had to get so much credit for the 80s.
But yeah, and I think that is the big absolute credit of it. But I think the downturn of it is just how, for fan enjoyment, I mean, at the circuit, I imagine spectating must be brilliant, because I remember I've watched quite a few of the races during this period from the 80s that you can get clips from on YouTube and full races on. And, not only were the marshals right by the barriers, you actually had fans right by the barriers up close to the races, and for a fan experience there, being that close to those cars must have been absolutely incredible. But as a whole, the TV package, obviously it's light years away from where it was. The graphics of updating you who was in the lead. For quite a lot of the race, you're relying on Murray Walker and James Hunt. Actually, that has to be a massive credit to them. The commentary teams of Walker and Hunt during the 80s was incredible, and probably the best partnership in F1 history. And without that, the graphics of it would certainly have been very hard to kind of keep track of what was actually going on track.
I think it's like, so I've done quite a few commentary gigs just for radio, and you have to make sure you're relaying as much information as possible. So like obviously they had the TV screens as well, but it was like you could describe it as radio commentary for TV, so to speak. And you get James Hunt call it. I could not tell you for the life of me the driver in question, but I believe didn't he call someone who was considered a paid driver just to be an absolute some, I can't remember the exact words he used, but he basically has a massive rant at this guy and calls him useless. And it's just it's that period of the 80s that everyone looks back on so well, and that just sums up F1 back then as well.
I think it was either Rene Arnoux or Riccardo Patrese. He's not particularly fond of either one, in fairness. But I think that was the brilliance of James Hunt, because you had Murray Walker's enthusiasm and passion for the sport that obviously has become iconic to it. But then you had James Hunt's bluntness, and for being an incredibly talented driver himself, and a guy who maybe didn't achieve the world title as he deserved because he enjoyed life. I mean, one of my favourite stories was the fact that he turned up on his first day of commentary with a cast on his leg and a bottle of wine in one hand. Sat down, put the cast on Murray Walker's lap, finished off the bottle of wine while commentating, and then someone else immediately brought in a fresh bottle for him to go through. So
you can look at him as the first F1 superstar, and that's what he probably made Formula One as attractive as it is. He made Formula One attractive, effectively. He did it with 1976, and he brought in again his posh bluntness in commentary. Just sort of that's elevated it even further, and sort of laid the foundations for what it has become, what it's gone on to become now. So I think James Hunt got a lot. Obviously, we're not considering the 70s, but James Hunt has a lot to do with creating this sort of golden era, these best decades we're talking about right now.
Yeah, I think he was incredible. Like you said, that probably was that kind of first. Obviously, there were superstars before, but probably the first accessible superstar that became loved by the masses, I would say. And he's a one-time world champion, but he's revered in status, especially within Britain. I would find he's often very fondly spoken about by British racing fans in there. But that probably wraps up the 80s in terms of the main negative for me was just the TV coverage. If it didn't have that commentary, was there, but it still had brilliant commentary to make up for that. But yeah, as a whole package, it wasn't quite there. It wasn't quite there yet. So we'll move on to the 1990s, and like I said in the poll, this was the winner of what people thought was the best decade of F1. A lot is because a lot of people, I think, really got into F1 in that stage because it was really accessible. It was better televised, and obviously it was the emergence of Michael Schumacher, and it saw some of Ayrton Senna's finest moments as well. It was an incredible decade.
Yes, well, when you put that poll out, I think I commented citing the 2000s as the best, but when I sort of reflected upon it more, like you can take away the fact that the TV got better, take away the fact that you've got like Senna in his prime, Schumacher in his prime. Just look at just go down to each individual season. And I think the only season that I couldn't tell you too much about would be the 1995 season, with the one that Schumacher basically romped to, every season in the 90s, pretty much. So you got 1990, Senna versus Prost in the Ferrari, Senna in the McLaren. 1991, Mansell versus Senna. 92 was when you got the dominant Williams, like probably the first proper modern Formula One car where technology just took over. I think that car had an automatic gearbox. It had the self-leveling suspension, traction control, all of this stuff beginning to come in, setting up Formula One for the future. Okay, yes, they did completely dominate, but it's still like you got to admire the machinery as well. Then you have the 93 season. Obviously, Prost returns from his sabbatical, comes back for 1 year, wins it. You also get the memorable Ayrton Senna lap at Donington. And then, 1994, yes, of course, we lost Senna and Ratzenberger, but even so, we still got a fantastic title battle between Schumacher and Hill. 95, obviously, Schumacher he went on to dominate that year, I think. Hill tried a bit, but couldn't really do it. Then you go 96, 97, Hill versus Villeneuve. Jacques Villeneuve, in his first year, coming so close to winning a world title. The only guy really challenging Damon Hill. Obviously, 11 years later, we'd see that again with Lewis Hamilton. But Villeneuve, the first proper championship-worthy rookie. 97, the brilliant battle between Villeneuve and Schumacher. 98 and 99, Hakkinen versus Schumacher, and obviously throw Eddie Irvine in there as well. So the theme for the 90s is that every single year had something memorable about it from a championship fight perspective. And I think that's why so many people got into that's why the 90s is where so many people got into Formula One. And I think if you're just looking at purely the championships alone, just a fantastic, fantastic decade for Formula One.
I'd completely agree with that. In terms of every decade, like I say, you can't really distinguish decades in this in terms of the drivers. You have to kind of look at the individual competitive seasons. Like I said, Prost versus Senna, taking that rivalry away from McLaren. Could Prost do it in Ferrari? But also, openly criticising Ferrari, and essentially, he left Ferrari, but essentially got sacked by Ferrari, which was huge at the time. Mansell in that Williams and fighting Senna wheel to wheel. I believe was it Brazil 91 that they were fighting wheel to wheel? It was somewhere. They certainly had one of their wheel to wheel battles.
Spain 91. That footage where they are literally you could put a bit of sandpaper between them. That's how close they were. It's coming down the main straight at Catalunya.
Yeah, and that's just an absolutely incredible moment. And like you said, you had the 92 season where the Williams was just so dominant. What a car that was! But you also had that moment at Monaco where those are probably the most intense last laps of a Formula One Grand Prix ever, in terms of the fact that Mansell fainted after getting out the car due to the physical exertion he put on it and the defensive drive in terms of making no mistakes under immense pressure from Senna was just incredible. And yet the emergence of Michael Schumacher, obviously, qualifying in 7th in his first showing at Spa, and then going to Benetton, and just he himself in 1992 began to be that emerging talent, and 93 he would fight, and then obviously 94, 95 he would become a two-time world champion, the first ever German world champion, and one of my favourite rivalries just because they went so far ahead of everyone else. And because there was so much respect between the two, is Schumacher and Hakkinen. I just thought it was an absolutely incredible rivalry, and probably the best rivalry in terms of respect between the two in a competitive title battle. It was immense. 98 was an incredible season.
Yeah, I know. I think for a second there, I thought you were going to say Schumacher and Hill. And I was like, you're barking right up the wrong tree there. But then no, Hakkinen and Schumacher. I think what sums up Hakkinen versus Schumacher the best, I think, is the moment in, I think it's Italy 2001 or Italy 2000, where Schumacher equals Ayrton Senna's win record and he starts crying, and Hakkinen just sort of puts, or he doesn't do it. He just says, "Can we move on?" You can tell that he's completely overwhelmed by it as well. So yeah, that respect between Schumacher and Hackney, they were such fierce rivals on track, but off track you could tell there was that mutual respect. So yeah, the first proper respectful rivalry to see in Formula One, and then on to Schumacher as well. Obviously, probably you have to say the first what you would define as modern Formula One driver. He came in. His physical fitness was impeccable. He was designed pure. Everything about him was designed for racing. He didn't have a stupid moustache on his face like Mansell did. Even although still it can't take away the achievement winning a world championship with a moustache. Just again, brilliant achievement for Mansell. And the fact that the last driver from the 90s to retire was Michael Schumacher. He was able to go on so long. Yes, he had a 3 season break in 07, 08 and 09, but he still came back in his 40s and competed relatively well, getting a podium in a car that wasn't always up there as a front runner. But yeah, just Schumacher dominated his emergence in the 90s, even going to the struggling Ferrari team in '96 and being able to win in such dominance in Spain that year, and being the only guy to come close to Hill and Villeneuve in a car that was not capable of it, just shows how great he was. Shows the spirit of the 90s. Again, he was involved in every single championship fight to one extent or another from 94, from actually, as you say, from 93 until 1999, and then obviously we saw what happened in the early 2000s. But yeah, Schumacher's got to be he has to be the driver of the decade, and it's obviously just such a shame we never got to see a proper Schumacher versus Senna championship.
Yeah, that is the biggest rivalry we lost, and yeah, you mentioned there, it's certainly not the greatest rivalry of all time in terms of Schumacher versus Hill, but it was certainly a rivalry that added something as well. Even the unexpected rivalries gave something that was of real intrigue and real enjoyment, I think, to the sport. And you know, the 2000s have the fairy tale championship of obviously Jenson Button winning with Brawn. Well, although obviously it was the championship capable car and it was the best car, Damon Hill was never that guy expected to be a world champion. He was never from the start, and even when you hear kind of Sir Frank Williams talking about him, he talks about Damon was the real surprise. He was the guy who got it, and he endeared himself, I think, to the British public. I mean, I think you know, JJ, growing up in our culture in this country, that there is the love of supporting the underdog. And I think Damon was certainly very popular. Like my mum, who's not even really massively into Formula One, she's like, Damon was my favourite. You know, I think he certainly had a lot of people fighting his corner and very excited to do it. But she sums it up perfectly. I remember talking about it from doing a video. She was like, I really like Damon. Bless him. Schumacher was better though. But but you know, it's
yeah, no, I think
yeah,
it's completely summed up there. It's that love of the underdog. I think it's why Lewis Hamilton isn't looked at in the same vein as the likes of Hill, Mansell, all of these, but Button as well, Coulthard even. It's because Hamilton is the king. He's the one that they're trying to topple, and we, as Britons, we always root for the underdog, and for the majority of our time, we've always been the underdogs, and that's why Damon Hill captured the imagination so well. That's why Schumacher was ultimately the great enemy. That's why Vettel became the great enemy as well. Yeah, just I think it also, as you say about Hill being the underdog, the fact he then got dropped by Williams after he won the championship, then spent a few years in an Arrows and a Jordan, and then just left the sport fairly. I can't think of the word. Just fairly with a bit of a whimper, so to speak. Just sort of obviously just lost his ambition for it as well. But another thing coming on to the 90s is the fact you mentioned it earlier, Schumacher qualifying 7th in a Jordan. Obviously, Jordan only entered the sport. Was it 1991? And the fact that a team that's only 2 years old could qualify 7th, would that happen nowadays if they tried to enter as a proper privateer team, not buying all their parts from Ferrari? I think that would be very unexpected and would definitely not happen. So again, it shows how in the 90s, as whilst technology was coming in, whilst manufacturers were starting to become more and more a part of Formula One, still showed that the little guy, the privateer teams could still come in and be competitive almost immediately. And can't forget as well the fantastic 1-2 for Jordan in 98 at Belgium. Races like that showing that these smaller teams could do so well.
Yeah, I think that is another really big positive for the 90s. Just standout races. How many standout races are there in the 90s? You know, you just go like that 98 Belgian, the 96 Spanish Grand Prix, Monaco 92, Monaco 96, isn't it, as well? That was it 4 cars finished that race in there? Crazy. Obviously Brazil 91 with Senna as well. You can just, there's like a countless list of like classic races that happened in the 90s that you just go, even today, you go back and watch and you go, these are just fantastic to watch. Even though I know the outcome, even though I know exactly what's going to happen, I still will sit down and enjoy just watching this race and appreciating it for what it was, which is great F1. And I think that's also a really important point you made. The 90s definitely still had that stage, although McLaren and Williams dominated in terms of the Constructors and the Drivers' Championships. Obviously, those 2 middle years of Benetton in 94 and 95 upsetting the apple cart. But yeah, just there was still so much competitive to it and so much innovation still going in. It hadn't quite been restricted. There was still difference in the way that the cars looked. You got the ugly X-Wings kind of got introduced in 97. A great team like Tyrrell was still there. Brabham was still there for a short while. Obviously Benetton were a fashion brand, weren't they, in terms of the car. Like I said, Arrows as well. There was a lot of the great independent teams still competing in the grid. It wasn't completely overruled and dominated by manufacturers. Well, I guess you had the ultimate battle of that decade between an independent and a manufacturer in terms of McLaren versus Williams, although you can technically classify McLaren as an independent, but as they make road cars, they kind of are a little bit of a manufacturer to me. But yeah, it was brilliant for its overall competitive nature, I think, the 90s.
Yeah, I know, and actually, a slight little divert here. Obviously, you talk about the independent teams of the 90s. We cannot forget the most infamous team of the 1990s. I think they came in 1997. Obviously, the great Mastercard Lola. Let's not forget about them. Obviously, showing where independents don't necessarily always go right, but obviously creating some great stories. One great story as well is the fact that my girlfriend's family actually they were Mastercard Lola. Something I found out very early on, and something that made me think, yep, she's the one for me. So yeah, that's nice little story about the 90s there in the independent team. So yeah, that's why I always look out for the independent teams of Formula One, and particularly the 90s.
Yeah, there's just something about an independent team because you go, they're just there because they love F1 and they want to be successful. They aren't there because it's going to help them sell more cars in the real world. They aren't there because it's going to boost their brand in the world or anything like that. And obviously we need that because F1 is an incredibly expensive sport, and to push the engineering boundaries to what they need to be the best in the world, which is what F1 is, it needs those manufacturers to be pumping the money into it and want to see the benefit. But also it's that independent, the love of the sport. They're almost the fan teams, I think. You know, Peter Sauber still going with Alfa Romeo, although obviously, you know, yeah, with the face of Alfa Romeo, it is still Sauber really at the heart of that team.
That's it. Like, that's a team that's been on the grid since the 1990s, and obviously Racing Point used to be Jordan. Alpha Tauri used to be Minardi. Red Bull were Jaguar, and then they were Stewart beforehand, I think. So yeah, you just see a lot of teams still on the grid today can have traced their roots back to the 1990s. So it's a season where it's a decade where so much happened for Formula One in the good, and some bits some bits would then disappear and lead to the bad. Obviously, as you say, the independent teams, the guys that had the love for just pure racing, wanting to go racing, not promote a brand or anything. That the 90s is probably where those teams could come in and do well. I think the last if you had to say the last teams that entered Formula One to try and just go racing, you'd have to look at like the 4 of the past 5 new teams: Super Aguri, HRT, Manor, and Team Lotus / Caterham. And I know obviously Haas have come in as well, but they're an engineering firm. They're coming in to promote. They're effectively there to promote their own brand. So yeah, the 90s, I think 90s, 2000s, that's where you could see, or certainly in the 90s, that's where you could still see the independent teams flourishing, and they'd obviously go on a massive decline through the 2000s and 2010s. So that's why the 90s for me, just look at them and say that was just one of, if not the best times for Formula One.
Well, probably the key moment on that basis that has affected those teams was obviously the 1997 Concord Agreement that completely changed in terms of the restructuring in how money was awarded and distributed within the sport. And that is obviously a massive one that I think has played a big impact on a obviously huge team at the time in Williams within Formula One has got to the situation where obviously recently we've had the news that Williams is up for sale, either by part sale or full sale, because they're struggling financially, and it was the independents, I think, were the hardest ones to struggle to adapt to the new rules after that Concord Agreement, and they were the ones who resisted it the most, and unfortunately it never really turned out and they didn't adapt or pay to it. But we'll move on to the 2000s, and I think for me, really, it'd be interesting to see what you say when we get into this. But for me, I think it, in my head, is between the 90s and the 2000s as an overall package. And I know you said initially, you did comment on that tweet on the poll, that it was the 2000s. And yeah, what are your thoughts on the 2000s, JJ?
So I think if you look at the 80s, 90s, 2000s, I think 80s is where the teams began to have a massive impact on the sport. 90s is where the drivers came in, and then for me, the 2000s was where so teams are the appeal of the 80s, drivers of the 90s, and then the cars of the 2000s are what make us to this day even 6 years after the hybrid engines got brought in, everyone is still saying, "Can we have the V8s back? Can we have the V10s back? Can we have the V12s back?" These cars were obviously narrower than what we have now. Their aero packages weren't as good, but if you look at where do all of the best lap times for Formula One cars come from, particularly obviously I know they run without full tanks now, but all of the lap times came from that 2004 season. You could just see how these cars were going. They'd been so safe now. You can have massive crashes and come out of it relatively unscathed, and yet they were still going faster and faster and faster. The fact that the Juan Pablo Montoya's lap at Monza was the fastest lap in Formula One for 14 years just shows where these cars were by the end of that 2004 season. Yes, I know that Schumacher won every single year, 2000 to 2004, and that ruins it a little bit because it's that dominance that we don't like to see. We like to see the competition, but even so, 2000 was a great fight. Again, it was part 3 of Schumacher versus Hakkinen. 01 and 02, okay, yes, that was just Schumacher completely dominated. But as you mentioned it right at the start, the 2003 season, where you had Raikkonen versus Schumacher versus Montoya. You had the emergence of Fernando Alonso as well. Still creating a great season. Then yes, okay, the 2004 season, I think Martin Brundle once said it, that was the last properly boring season of Formula One. But even so, like you look at, I looked at that season once, and I looked at Schumacher's record for the 2004 season. It's actually quite scary because I think he won pretty much every race, bar the Monaco Grand Prix where he crashed, up until he won the championship. Or I think he didn't win in Monaco, he didn't win in Belgium. He won every other race up until that point, and then he took his 7th World Championship. I think he won one more and then fell off the bubble a bit. But obviously by then it's like, well, I've won the championship. It's not as important anymore. But even he still won't go down and competes. But it's still to see that level of competitiveness, to see that kind of dominance. It's one of those things. It's like Messi and Ronaldo in football right now. It's like when they're gone, you're going to reminisce about them so much, and I think that's what's happened to that Schumacher Ferrari period of the 2000s. But then even then, like that period ends. You then go into if you take decades out of it, you start what I think is the actual golden era of Formula One, which maybe not the 2005 season, but from 2006 up to probably 2012, each of those seasons were pretty much were spectacular. 06, Alonso versus Schumacher, the changing of the guard, so to speak, where Schumacher went into a championship fight and lost, and Alonso, who a lot of people still consider one of the greatest F1 drivers of all time, even though he only won 2 championships and a couple, and I say only 33 races, but still 33 races. Not as much compared to the likes of Hamilton, Schumacher, Vettel, Prost, etc. And then you've got 2007, the freeway fight between Raikkonen, Alonso, and Hamilton. The massive falling out between Alonso and Hamilton. Who'd have thought that a rookie going up against the 2-time world champion would actually compete and have a better chance of winning the championship than the champion? And then obviously the final lap drama at 2008, Hamilton versus Massa. That season as well was also nearly a 4-way fight down to the very wire. Obviously, Raikkonen was in there as well, just he made a few too many mistakes. Kubica as well in the BMW Sauber. That was amazing to see him come through and win. In Canada, and amazing to see him still be there when they stopped investing in the car. And then finally, you round off the 2000s with, as you mentioned it a little bit earlier, the Button and Brawn, one of the greatest fairy tale stories of Formula One that we will never see again. It's the Leicester City of Formula One, that is. And yes, whilst he led that championship from start to finish, the fact that because the car didn't have the investment compared to the big teams like McLaren, Ferrari, and Red Bull, the fact it was still able to hold on and win that championship was just a phenomenal period. And again, it's 2000 you can split in half. You've got the amazing brilliance of Ferrari and Schumacher that will be looked at very favourably now. Obviously, at the time it was a bit dull, and then you've got the I didn't really even mention 05. Like even then, Raikkonen could have won that championship. It was still Alonso versus Raikkonen for that one. So then you've got the just sheer competitiveness of 05 to 09. And it was a 06 to 09, obviously a different champion every single year. In fact, throw 2010 in there as well. So yeah, I know I've gone on a little bit here, but the 2000s just have so much going for them in terms of championships, drivers, racing, cars, all of those things that you look for in a great era of Formula One.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that is a positive note to the 2000s, is the fact that you could go on about it so much. And I think those Ferrari championships have aged like a fine wine. And it is important to remember the 2000s and 2000 and 2003, because they were actually very tough championships. And Michael, the laps he put in at Suzuka to win that championship in 2000 was incredible. And the pure emotion and sheer determination that he had brought that Ferrari team from where it started, that journey from 1996 to where it kind of, well, for him, hadn't finished, because obviously they went on to dominate for the next 4 years. But, you know, it almost felt like he'd achieved what he'd always gone there to do. He'd brought back success to Ferrari after winning the first Drivers' Championship for them since 1979, which was just incredible. In 2003, that 3-way fight, because it wasn't Ferrari way, but it had that everything that season. It had the Juan Pablo Montoya and Raikkonen fighting Schumacher. Although Schumacher had 6 wins, it was inconsistent all over the place. Ralf Schumacher was in it for a little bit as well. He was brilliant in that mid part of the season when the Williams car was. Then obviously had the controversy of the Montoya penalty. I think it was in the US Grand Prix in the rain that finally ruled him out in that race. And also, the controversy, I think it was at Hungary that Ferrari put in about the Michelin tyres that obviously then affected it for the rest of the season, and Ferrari won every race after that, after Michelin had to change the tyres. And 2002 and 2004 in particular, they have to be admired. At the time, obviously, it wouldn't have been great to watch, but now, looking at it as a whole decade, the level of dominance for a team to achieve and the sheer consistency of Michael Schumacher in that time was incredible. It really was like, before Mercedes came along, I don't think anyone could match that level of sheer brilliance, and Mercedes have come along and obviously put their own note on history with the level of dominance that they can achieve. And yeah, like you said, 2005 to 2009, they were incredibly competitive seasons. A title fight between Alonso and Kimi, the next two generations, that's like seeing a title fight between Max and Charles Leclerc in modern times for us, for modern F1 fans. That's the one that's kind of got really excited and everyone loved that. Yeah, the 2006 going down to Suzuka, and when obviously Michael, it seemed like he was going to get that fairy tale finish, announced his retirement at Monza, had fought his way back into the championship, and then the first time, his just engine had kind of given up on him. I think it was his first time since 2001. It was ages since an engine had kind of failed on him and got him over the line. And Alonso's celebrations he goes through, it meant so much to I think this decade also saw Michael Schumacher go from one of the top talents ever to be in F1 to becoming a legend, breaking all the records. It was just absolutely fantastic to witness and see. And the emergence of Hamilton, the fall, you could say, of the next great talent in Fernando Alonso in terms of his public perception. It had the controversy of Spygate, it had the controversy of Crashgate, which aren't brilliant for the sport, but in terms of the drama and everything that goes along that, it adds to the whole thing. And plus the TV way that it was being watched, the coverage of the sport was becoming so much more slick. It was improving the experience for fans watching around the world, not only the fans who went to the Grand Prix circuits. Drivers were still pretty accessible at circuits at that stage. I think it was just an absolute brilliant decade of F1.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously, you mentioned we obviously had '07, we had Spygate, Crashgate '08, and then obviously the McLaren Liegate of '09. And I know obviously Crashgate came out in 2009, but it happened in 2008. So we had 3 years of gates, so to speak. I think we talk about the 2000s as obviously from a really positive point of view. I think there are some negative things we have to bring up. I think this is where obviously the aero was becoming so much more important. This is where you saw the racing begin to suffer. You wouldn't see too much in the way of on-track overtakes. It all had to be done through the strategy. You get races such as, I think it was Spain 2008, Europe 2009, no on-track overtakes at all. And I think that's of big detriment to the sport. I think this is also where you see the emergence of the pay drivers, or the proper pay drivers. Your likes of Yuji Ide, your Sakon Yamamoto's, these kind of guys. Obviously, as well, the falling away of some great names. Obviously, Jordan fell by the wayside in 2006 for the forgettable Midland team, and then obviously Spiker came along as well. Force India obviously replaced them, and Racing Point since. And yeah, I think as well, and another thing you mentioned, the '97 Concord Agreement. I think the 2009 Concord Agreement has to be looked on in less favourable terms as well, where there was the whole argument of there was the pay gap that was, or the budget cap that was introduced. Only Force India and Williams had signed on for that Concord Agreement, at the time. There were talks of the split away, and it's just sort of a really negative time for Formula One. We saw the departure of Max Mosley, which I think has been significant for Formula One. He was obviously such a revered figure, and to lose him and get in the much more passive Jean Todt, as we discussed right at the start of this, the effect on the 2010s that was massively detrimental for it. So while we can talk about how great the championships were, you still have to look at the quality of racing and these negative things that do just begin to seep their way into Formula One and have then since been magnified since. They've tried to bring in these artificial things like DRS and the energy recovery systems and all that to try and fix it. But ultimately, if you took the toys away like DRS, you wouldn't have too much different. It'd probably even now be worse than what it was towards the back end of the 2000s. So I think you can say that's where racing almost stopped, so to speak.
I'd agree with that. I'd say that is a massive detriment to it, the on-track action. At the early stage of it, up until like the 2005, 6, you could say it was a steady and almost quite rapid decline. In 2009, although it's the fairy tale season, if you actually watch back, the quality of the races and racing wasn't good at all. But what I would say, although racing was hard on track, you then saw the quality of the overtakes improve. The Hakkinen overtake in Belgium in 2000 was a brilliant one. The Alonso overtake at Suzuka in 2005, obviously Kimi Raikkonen, that race as well on the last lap of Giancarlo Fisichella, and drivers really had to earn, and it really showed the skill of an overtake. But as fans, it needs to be somewhere in between where we've got with the DRS and what was back then. Because if you have no overtakes, like you said, it isn't much of a spectacle. It's a procession, and nobody really wants to sit around and watch 70 laps of the same cars winning week in, week out. But on the other hand, we don't want to go as far as we've gone with DRS, which I think, although we've got a lot more overtaking, a lot of the overtaking is now artificial, because it's basically, if any car is in the DRS zone on the straight, bam, it's a clean overtake without anything. There isn't really anything. The only one's probably 2019. You would say Ferrari had a powerful enough engine to combat that with the Mercedes on the straight. I think Charles Leclerc at Monza probably was the best example, showing how that was. But I think that certainly has to come into consideration. And obviously 2005 was a real low point at the Indianapolis Grand Prix, where obviously only 6 cars raced in it, and that was a really poor example. And I think that Max Mosley point is fascinating, and I think leadership, there has been a gap in it, and it's going to be really interesting. Obviously, Jean Todt has announced that he won't be running for the next presidency, will he? I'm not sure he could. I think he'd kind of done the longest stint that he possibly could do. But the new leadership is going to be fascinating to see it, and it certainly probably was a detriment to how that decade of the 2010s ended. So we've looked at everything. We ruled out the 60s, 50s, 70s, and 2010s pretty quickly. The 80s are really up there for me. They're really kind of a really positive decade, but it is, I think, between the 2000s and the 1990s as a complete package. So JJ, I'm gonna give you the difficult decision first. Which one of those decades comes out on top, or does the 80s come out on top for you?
So for me, I think the 80s went about creating modern Formula One, in that you see, in that, like, from a negative point of view, you can say that you see these cars getting completely absurd with the amount of power they had to be reined in. But again, the draw of the drivers, the draw of the teams, the draw of the, as we mentioned, the commentary, all added up to set up Formula One to become what it became. And I think the 80s are owed a massive debt for that. I wouldn't, for me, I wouldn't put the 80s as the best one because it was still all new. It was all still it was a bit too absurd, and it was still dangerous. Obviously, we lost Gilles Villeneuve during that time. I know that in the 90s we lost Ratzenberger and Senna, but it was a much safer time. 2000s we lost no one, so that for me just puts the 80s at a slight disadvantage. I think the difficult decision. Obviously, I look at the 2000s with a lot of respect. As you say, you've got to respect what Schumacher and Ferrari did. But I think I love a good championship fight. I love just not knowing who's going to win this championship, or just saying like it could be Mansell, it could be Senna, it could be Vettel, it could be Hamilton, it could be Raikkonen, it could be Alonso. That's the bit I love. And for me, the 90s generated that more, and that's why I know I obviously, again, I said it in the Twitter, I thought the 2000s, but looking back on it, thinking about it, seeing the 90s for me fits perfectly. This is going to be a very stupid thing what I'm going to say here, but it's true. The 90s fit perfectly between the 80s and the 2000s because it lost the insaneness of the 80s, made it a bit more sensible, but it didn't have the ultimate bore factor that could plague the 2000s. I think that the 90s was the decade for fans. The 2000s was the decade for racing fans, and that's why I think. But then, obviously, when I say fans, the 90s appeals to casual viewers and racing fans. And that for me, my difficult decision is it has to be the 90s, in my opinion, best decade for Formula One.
I think that was a very good roundup of things, JJ. I think I agree with the 80s. The 80s was the rawness, refined process of where we're getting to. And you can argue that the 2010s are hopefully what that is for going into the 2020s, because it was new getting the V6 hybrid. We've had that whole dominance of Mercedes, but hopefully everything's is kind of balancing it out at.
Sorry, Michael. It's almost the opposite of the 80s. It's like the 80s were going absolutely bonkers and mad and getting ridiculous. The 2010s have just gone. So the 80s gone on an upward spiral. The 2010s on a downward spiral. We're hoping to come back out of it, whereas the 90s we were sort of coming down from the 80s. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'd completely agree with that, and yeah, I think you have to have set up decades for what are to come, and I think you're right, although it does, I get what you mean, but it sounds like, well, of course, obviously the 1990s fits perfectly between the 80s and 2000s, because that's how it works, but yeah, exactly, but I think you're right, I think there was just that perfect element of casual fans, racing fans. There are so many, I think, more iconic moments, and F1 is remembered fondly for the right reasons. Obviously, the sad and tragic deaths of Ratzenberger and Senna in '94. You know, that's something that shook F1 fans. You know, I know talking to people around that time. Well, I know someone whose wife just didn't watch F1 for a couple of decades, I think, after that, because it shook her so much. But it also was the mainstay and a factor that changed safety in Formula One for the better. And it shouldn't have resulted in a death to get to that stage, but it then went and improved. But you had great rivalries between Hill and Schumacher, Hakkinen, Senna, Mansell, Senna, Prost. You got the tail end of that one. You got glimpses of Senna and Schumacher, although never obviously culminating to a full title battle. But it was, yeah, I think it has to be the 90s. Just everything combined, incredible factor. You had the commentary of Murray Walker in there as well, which I think commentary is obviously I think often an underrated factor in it, and everyone remembers Murray Walker so fondly, but I've a lot of going back and watching these classic races. If I can't watch it with commentary, and a lot of the kind of races on F1 TV, they don't have commentary, and it's still enjoyable to watch the races, but commentary almost brings the story to life, because an F1 race is kind of almost like a story that you're watching unfold before your eyes, and it's just that perfect blend. And he's an art. He's the best that's ever been within the sport, and hopefully one day we might get a commentator like him within the sport again. That's not necessarily knocking Crofty and Brundle too hard, but they aren't on the level. So it's...
Don't bring David Croft up amongst Rich T circles. The other guys absolutely loathe him. They really do. So yeah, I think bring up Crofty and Walker in the same sentence. Dangerous game, my friend. Dangerous game.
I'll keep that one quiet, well, other than the fact that obviously Murray Walker is of legend status within F1 on a commentary background. But F1, it's been kind of amazing to see it unfold. I think its golden era to date has been between the evolution of the 80s, 90s, and almost like a downfall trilogy during the 2000s, in terms of, although yeah, it's hard to say that, because like you said, 2005 to 2012 were incredible. So it's unfair to kind of say that it was a downward spiral completely, but you know what I mean. It is kind of,
they lost the majesty of what had come before them, basically.
Yeah, I think F1 had even got itself to the #1 sport in the world during the time in the 80s and early 90s. And obviously it's lost its way in that status around the world that Liberty are doing hard to go at. But JJ, it's been an absolutely fantastic discussion. I've really enjoyed this. It's brilliant to kind of reminisce. But thank you so much for coming on.
No problem. Thank you for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. Hopefully we can do a few more in the future.
Yeah, I think we have a couple more things lined up, JJ.
I reckon so.
We certainly got a few things in the pipeline. But guys, like I said at the start of this episode, if you haven't already dropped a subscribe to the Rich T Boys, please do go and check out their channel, especially if you enjoy the go-karting element of it. They do some really great coverage of that. JJ yourself, obviously, has done a bit of commentary on the go-karting front and given some tips on that, because we all like to kind of feel like racers, and go-karting is the most easily accessible front to do that.
It's going to be back 12th of July. 12th of July it should be back. Hopefully I'll be able to get myself up to Shennington for round 1 of the Club 100 Endurance SP60 Championship. So provided that I can get there, we'll bring that to you as soon as we possibly can, because we can't wait for it to come back.
See, there you go. Exclusive there on the channel to getting the kind of comeback with Rich T there. And they obviously as well do lots of F1 coverage as well, talking about the latest topics and thoughts on things within the sport, just like we do on this channel. So make sure you kind of go out and help those boys over at Rich, and girls, obviously Suzanne included in that as well, over at the Rich T Racing group. But guys, that's been it from us today here. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Obviously, as always, let us know in the comments down below what you thought, what you think is the best decade or the golden era of F1, so to say. And it'd be fascinating as always to hear. And if you're new around here, you can subscribe to the channel, click that bell notification, and you can keep up to date with all our latest content, remembering that F1 Worldwide fan podcasts come out every Saturday during this Corona break. But looks like Austria might be happening, but we won't get too kind of excited until it actually is happening. So hopefully racing's on the horizon. But for now, you F1 fans, keep racing.